Our next speaker this morning is Oliva Rucellai, who studied, trained as an art historian, specializing in the history of Italian ceramics. And since 2002, she's been curator of the Richard Ginori Museum in Florence. Her interests extend to other forms of the applied arts. She's made a study of straw manufacture in Tuscany, but her main focus of study is on 19th and 20th century ceramics. Among her most recent publications is her contribution to the catalogue of an exhibition held at the Stibet Museum in Florence dedicated to the revival of Italian Majolica, Ginori and Cantagalli, and she's presently working on the catalogue of Gioponti-designed ceramics at the Richard Ginori Museum. Her talk today is entitled Majolica Made in Italy, Renaissance Revival from Forgery to Eclecticism. Please join me in welcoming Oliva Rucellai.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank the Bard Graduate Center for inviting me. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to learn and share views about this fascinating topic. The aim of my talk is to give an overview of Italian Majolica in the second half of the 19th century. I will consider mainly the Ginori and Cantagalli factories, both based in the Florentine area, because they've probably been the most successful and representative of this period. But we'll also show some relevant examples made in Faenza, Bologna, Gubbio, Naples, and in Le Nove di Bassano in the Veneto region. In the first part, I will talk about the origin of this production, that is, of course, the imitation of ancient Renaissance Majolica. In the second part, I will show you the main types of Italian eclectic Majolica, comparing specimens of different factories. I will direct special focus on the involvement of independent artists, painters, and sculptors, ending with Galileo Chini, who introduced modernism in the Italian ceramics scene. First of all, let me remind you that the word Majolica in Italian means tin-glazed earthenware, the equivalent of Delftware or faience, and it refers to Renaissance objects as well as to later productions up to the present day. Here, on your left, a Majolica fragment of the 16th century, and on your right, a 19th century fragment of a Ginori Majolica garden seat. The technique is basically the same. On both fragments, the chipped surface and sides reveal the earthenware under the tin glaze. As you know, Majolica has been produced in Italy since the 14th century, or 13th or 14th century, but it is during the Renaissance from 1475 to 1580 approximately that it became the most refined and influential kind of ceramics made in Europe. After that, the so-called golden age of Italian Majolica came to an end, and other areas took the lead in the history of European ceramics. Majolica continued to be made and used in Italy in the following centuries, especially for functional, inexpensive wares, such as these plates made by the Ginori factory in the first half of the 19th century, or large ornamental wares, such as these garden seats. But towards 1850, these traditional materials seemed to be on the verge of extinction. Many Italian Majolica and creamware factories were forced to close because foreign industrial porcelain and stoneware were much more competitive for everyday use. They were cheaper and more resistant. We might say that Majolica survived thanks to historicism and thanks to scholars, collectors, and dealers who in the same years were getting more and more interested in ancient Renaissance Majolica. To my knowledge, the earliest episodes of 19th century Renaissance revival in ceramics were actually meant as restorations of existing Della Robbia ware. As early as 1838, Ginori restored the Della Robbia tile floor in Siena's Piccolomini library. In 1843, Ginori was commissioned to make new roundels with foundlings for the Ospedale degli Innocenti in Florence, for example. Here you can see the Della Robbia made by Ginori. But while these new works in Della Robbia style were being set in public buildings, somebody was already thinking about another kind of Renaissance Majolica, those plates and vessels whose prices were getting higher by the day, so high that the idea of making forgeries occurred to several people, more or less at the same time, and spurred clandestine research in this field. The first successful attempts were most probably made in order to be sold by dealers as genuine. About 1848, the Ginori manufactory at Doccia near Florence secretly started imitating Renaissance Majolica upon commission of the dealer Giovanni Freppa, who provided the originals to be copied. In 1855, the news spread and there was a big scandal. The Marquis Ginori defended himself, saying that he was not aware of what Freppa intended to do with his copies, while Freppa, on the other hand, declared that his sole aim had been to revive a splendid tradition. Imitating ancient Majolica involved rediscovering the Renaissance grammar of ornament, painting styles, as well as color recipes, and most difficult of all, the famous luster, that is to say, those special metallic glazes whose secrets seem to be lost. Ginori was the first factory in the world to rediscover this lost technique. Giusto Giusti, the factory's chemist, was able to produce the first lustered samples in Florence in 1854, and in Paris, 1855, he was awarded an honorable mention. This plate, now in Sèvres Cité de la Céramique, was given to the museum by the Marquis Ginori himself in the same year. And this is a monument in Della Robbia style, of course, to the chemist Giusto Giusti. This is in the church of Colonnata in Sesto Fiorentino. The discovery of luster was recognized as a remarkable achievement by contemporary connoisseurs and aroused great interest in collectors who were afraid of forgeries, of course, as well as manufacturers. This plate, for example, might have been bought by Léon Arnoux, art director of the Minton factory. It came to the Stoke-on-Trent Gallery's collection from one of Arnoux' descendants. I'd like to point out that the early examples of Ginori imitations of Renaissance Majolica have no mark. As you can see, the numbers here are inventory numbers. Therefore, the most faithful copies could actually be mistaken for originals. And this is why we cannot be entirely sure that this plate is by Ginori, since we don't have any documentary evidence to confirm it. It could be by another 19th century manufacturer. In 1855, Ginori displayed copies of Renaissance Majolica with and without luster, such as this pilgrim flask, based on an original Urbino flask in the Uffizi Gallery at the time, now is in the Museo del Bargello in Florence. On the right, you can see the certificate testifying that the painter Francesco Giusti copied the original in the Uffizi Gallery on behalf of the Marquis Carlo Ginori. As it is written in French, I assume that the certificate was displayed in Paris as a sort of quality guarantee. One of these Ginori flasks was acquired by the Musée de la Renaissance in Equen, France, as original in 1987. Apparently, it is so faithful to the original shape that one 19th century Ginori cover has been used to substitute the missing original cover of a similar 16th century flask in the Musée du Louvre. I had the chance to compare the 16th century one with the 19th century Ginori one in Paris. As you can see, they're really very, very similar. You can tell the difference, especially looking at the base. Anyway, encouraged by the good reception of its new artistic Majolica, Ginori decided to develop this line, which in 1861 already featured a good range of shapes and patterns. The London 1862 exhibition confirmed the interests of the public. In the Doccia Museum archives, we have the lists of commissions, and Léon Arnoux is recorded as having acquired a fluted ewer with grotesque, and a lustered plate depicting a putto on a dolphin. This is drawing of the fluted ewer. Independently, in Siena and Gubbio, for instance, or following the success of Ginori, other old factories of central Italy, such as Fergnani in Faenza, started making Majolica in the style of the Renaissance, and new factories were set up which specialized in this revival, such as Minghetti in Bologna in 1858. In this map of Italy, I marked the location of most of the factories which produced what was then called artistic Majolica, in order to distinguish it from plain everyday functional wear, and also from the so-called ornamental wear, such as garden seats. Not all, but most of them are shown. Some factories were actually very small workshops, some are probably unknown to us, and some were very short-lived. But anyway, as you can see, it was a widespread phenomenon, especially in central Italy. From 1855 to 1870, the imitation of Italian Renaissance Majolica, even if combined with other historical sources, was the main inspiration of this production. The only exceptions are the Veneto region, where some factories founded in the 18th century chose to revive their own historical Rococo repertoire. This is by Antoni Bon in Bassano. And Naples, as well, had a more contemporary style. This is a beautiful example. Going back to the Renaissance revival, one of the issues is what sources were used by the 19th century manufacturers, and above all, how they were used. As you know, Renaissance revival didn't mean just simple imitation, but involved the reinterpretation and combination. Both the Dolce archives in Sesto Fiorentino and the Cantagalli archives in Faenza still preserve plenty of different source materials, from drawings faithfully depicting the museum pieces. Here is one after a Deruta plate. The Cantagalli's Majolica plate has lusters in red and gold and green, a combination never to be found in the original Renaissance Majolica by Deruta. Other sources could be color plates from books. Here you see on your left a plate from Darcel and Delange depicting an Urbino salt cellar, and then the Ginori translation, it's an inkwell made about 1875. It is interesting to see how, by imitating Renaissance grotesques, for example, Majolica painters learned to interpret them in original ways, such as in this vase by the Farina factory. No, sorry. Oh. This is another example of a print source, and this is the Farina vase. And also photographs were used as source materials. This is a curious example. Ginori here copied the shapes of the vessels seen in this photograph of a painting by Vittore Carpaccio. Shapes and patterns of different existing objects and different media could be combined. Here is a 16th century rock crystal vessel, which was turned into Majolica by Cantagalli. And the proportions could also be completely transformed. The various combinations were endless, and Ulisse Cantagalli proved to be one of the most inventive from this point of view. The Renaissance Majolica revival in Italy also had emotional and ideological implications due to the historical context. In 1861, Italy, which for many centuries had been politically divided into a mosaic of small states, was united under the Savoy monarchy. Small centers that could boast a noble Majolica tradition, such as Faenza, Gubbio, or Pesaro, were particularly inclined to emphasize and revive their local glory, which was also a national glory. Whatever helped in reinforcing a still fragile sense of national identity was welcome. Renaissance art in general, which was extensively praised by foreigners, became a kind of national identity myth. This may well explain why portraits of national heroes such as Dante, Petrarca, Michelangelo, Machiavelli, became favorite subjects for Majolica plates or even figures. This is a wonderful specimen by the Farina factory from Faenza, depicting Michelangelo. A Doccia series of relief portraits of famous artists, including Palissy, in the La Robbia style, was sent to Vienna exhibition in 1873 and then used to decorate the facade of the factory building. This is Leonardo da Vinci, modeled by the sculptor Raffaele Pagliaccetti. Here we have Lorenzo Duca d'Urbino, after Michelangelo's marble statue, made in Majolica by the Minghetti factory from Bologna. Portraits were very popular in the 19th century also because of the influence of photography that made them affordable for a much larger public. This phenomenon had an interesting impact on Majolica as well, especially in the Gubbio area, where starting in 1875 we find portraits that were painted based on photographs. These are some examples. As you can see, the faces are painted in monochrome as if it were photographs, but they are entirely hand-painted, actually. Majolica painting on plates underwent other major innovations concerning the range of colors and the technique. The painters became so skilled that they were able to reproduce on Majolica famous old masters' paintings as if they were on canvas. Majolica plates were walled or framed in wood to be hung on or even set in the wall like proper paintings. They could also be set in furniture or boiserie. Botticelli, Benozzo Gozzoli, Raffaello were the most popular artists. But we find also Guido Reni, Carracci, and many other, not necessarily Renaissance painters. This is an example of Guido Reni's Aurora, a famous fresco in Rome, in Palazzo Rospigliosi, painted on a monumental base by Ginori. Up to this point, I have shown you how, in Italy, Renaissance revival Majolica shifted from the imitation of Renaissance ceramic specimens to the celebration of Italian art as a whole on Majolica. This Italian Renaissance myth soon also became a burden, a cliché that was difficult to get rid of, because the market tended to associate Italy with the Renaissance style and expected it from Italian manufacturers. On the other hand, the pressure of competition in the international exhibitions and the experts' criticism urged the factories to innovate as much as possible. Therefore, starting in the 70s, new exotic paths were being explored. One of them was the Hispano-Moresque tradition with its wonderful lusters. Another one was the so-called Syrian or Damascus or Rhodian ware style, which we now identify with Snick. This is a Cantagalli example. Hispano-Moresque and Snick ceramics had already attracted the attention of scholars and collectors and of artists such as Theodore Deck, for example, in France. In the 70s, they inspired William de Morgan as well. Italian manufacturers treated them exactly as the Italian Renaissance were, imitating and reinterpreting patterns and shapes. In Italy, the ancient specimens, especially Snick, were not easily accessible, though. Therefore, they used mainly printed sources and missed the texture and brightness of the original colors. Cantagalli was the only exception, thanks to his connection with museum people such as Robinson and Fortnum. He had the chance to copy objects in the British and South Kensington museums. He specialized in this genre, offering a very attractive assortment of Snick and Hispano-Moresque wares. Ulisse Cantagalli managed to offer desirable revival objects while keeping prices much lower than his competitors. He had just found the right balance between quality and price. Cantagalli was art director and manager of his factory as well as was Angelo Minghetti from Bologna, who was very successful as well. Both Minghetti and Cantagalli were talented managers with a sense for art, but also for business. Achille Farina, from Faenza, on the other hand, was a painter who had been teaching in the Academy of Fine Arts for many years and turned to ceramic in his 60s. In 1869, Achille Farina was able to translate his painting skills from canvas to ceramics. He introduced new techniques. Here is one of his masterpieces, a portrait in red on a white ground, as if it were a sanguine, red pencil on paper. This is a portrait of his daughter. Despite his talents, his factory went bankrupt many times until in 1888, Achille's son, Ludovico, gave up and moved to England, where he met De Morgan and worked with him for some time. Sometimes the collaboration of painters or sculptors with factories was limited to providing a unique piece for an exhibition or allowing the reproduction of one's work on Majolica, such as this plaque imitating a painting by the famous Neapolitan painter Domenico Morelli. Sometimes a painter would provide the design for one or a few objects. This vase was designed by Giovanni Muzioli, a quite successful painter at the time. And this shapes all very well. It is interesting, I think, because the naturalistic rendering of the bright green leaf and the relief flowers around the vase's foot, even if combined with a Renaissance pattern, remind me of Minton Majolica. In other cases, painters or sculptors were asked to work as art directors, such as Urbano Lucchesi, who was art director of Ginori from 1880 to 1900. This is a centerpiece by Lucchesi, a signed centerpiece. And again, I see here a taste for three-dimensional, bright-colored, whimsical composition that is very similar, I think, to Minton Majolica taste. And anyway, it would probably appeal to the same kind of public. Lucchesi created also a series of peasant figures, street sellers, represented in a naturalistic way, sometimes in pairs, which had a narrative going on between them. This is called The First Sorrow. Literary figures were also popular, like in this exhibition piece with Fausto and Margherita after Goethe. And Neapolitan factories tended to indulge in the cliché of picturesque seaside landscape with fishermen. These two pieces are very interesting, I think, because they are conceived as a sort of three-dimensional, naturalistic still life to be hung on the wall. There are tambourines, castanets, and other things, and the painting as well. These last examples to show that Italian 19th century artistic Majolica was much more than Renaissance revival. There was experimentation, technical innovation, unique pieces and serial production, painters and sculptors who became directly involved in different ways or even set up their own factories, such as Achille Farina. The world of painters and sculptors and the world of ceramics had never been so close as in this period. This is a clear sign of prosperity and popularity, I think. Nevertheless, this eclectic combination of ornaments and figurative styles could not go on forever. The richness of the formula was bound to get tiresome. However inventive and well manufactured, what might have amused and charmed in the 80s, in the 90s started looking repetitive, incoherent, and excessive. It was difficult for artistic Majolica manufacturers to find a fresh approach. It was Galileo Chini, son of a restorer and decorator, the first to take a more radical step towards modernism as opposed to historicism. In 1896, he set up a new ceramic workshop in Florence called L'Arte della Ceramica. This is an example of his early style. As you can see, the shape is still typical Neo-Renaissance. But the real innovation introduced by Galileo Chini was the stylization of the figures and landscape. The thick black contour line was the expression of a new language. This style was inspired by the British Pre-Raphaelites, whose works were shown for the first time in Italy in 1895 at the Venice Biennale, and were recognized as the origin of modernism. It is interesting to note that Ginori, who tried to imitate Chini's new style, missed the most innovative aspect of it. This vase by Ginori, with a figure after Proserpina by Dante Gabriele Rossetti, as you can see, there is no stylization of the figures and landscape. Ironically, the new style was marketed by Ginori as Stile Botticelli, to emphasize the Italian source, which had originally inspired the Pre-Raphaelites and the aesthetic movement. But, as I said, the real innovation was in the stylization of the figures introduced by Galileo Chini and soon imitated by the other small factories in the Florentine area, such as this one. Galileo Chini continued on this path, and by 1900, the human figure disappears from his ceramics. His bold colors, stylized flowers, and animal patterns, sometimes with beautiful luster, are now praised by collectors and scholars as the best expression of Italian Art Nouveau ceramics. So this is how evolved the art ceramics scene in the artistic ceramics scene in Majolica. But what is interesting is that in some way the Renaissance, the neo-Renaissance style continued in Italy well into the 20th century. Ginori catalog, there are Ginori catalog dating to 1940 that still have a selection of Renaissance Majolica work. And even today we have in some historically famous for Majolica towns like Faenza or Montelupo, a production, a kind of tourist souvenir production that is inspired by neo-Renaissance revival. So it's something that is still alive today, even if in the critics don't consider it really interesting. And it's also interesting that the production of the late 19th century, such as the Lucchesi works I've shown you before, such as this or this, in the 20th century have been almost deleted by Ginori's history. In the museum we don't have any piece by Lucchesi. It was really totally forgotten. We've just recently rediscovered him. A colleague of mine, Rita Balleri, researched, and we were able to acquire a group of these of his production, but it is a very recent acquisition, 2011. Before, there was nothing in the museum, really. So it's really more or less what happened to the Majolica, the Minto Majolica. So I think it's really the same taste and the same public, even if it's something different. So thank you.